Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Planetary Pause series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today we are honored to host Peter Goodman, who is the author of Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World, kind of says it all. He is also the author of Past Due, The End of Easy Money and the Renewal of the American Economy. He is an economics journalist and a global economics correspondent for the New York Times. He played a leading role in the paper's award-winning coverage of the Great Recession, including a series that was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. He was previously based in London at the Times European Economics correspondent there. And prior to London, he spent a decade in Shanghai as the bureau chief for the Washington Post. He has reported from more than a dozen countries, including Iraq, Sudan, Cambodia, Myanmar, Guatemala, and India. So I want to encourage you all to buy this book. Also, Davos Man is an incredible read and knowledge that we should all have at our fingertips, especially if we're interested in politics and how politics works, not only domestically, but globally. So welcome, Peter. It's great to have you with us today.
Thanks so much, George. I really appreciate being here. And thanks for that lovely introduction.
Well, you're certainly welcome. I want to ask you, the first question I want to ask you isn't about from your book, but it's very relevant right now, and the rest of them will be from the book. But this is something that I've noticed, and I think a lot of people have, is the dollar-euro exchange right now is so different than it's been for years. It's like it was in 2000 and 2002. The euro, 1 euro equals $1. What happened, and why is that the case, and are we going to see any change soon?
There's a lot that's packed into that, but the short version is, the Federal Reserve, our central bank, has been lifting rates aggressively in the States in an effort to stamp out inflation. And when you do that, that makes the return on rock solid investments like U.S. government bonds a little bit more attractive, and money tends to flow, out of places like low income and middle income countries and into the safety of countries like the US. And that sends the dollar higher. And meanwhile, in Europe, the European Central Bank has been very reluctant to lift interest rates because while they are also worried about inflation, they're especially worried about a hit to economic growth. We just saw the government in Italy collapse in large part because borrowing costs there are spiking, inflation is higher. And of course, they're dealing in a very dramatic way with the implications of the sanctions on Russia in response to Putin's attack on Ukraine. I mean, Germany is heavily dependent. Germany is Europe's largest economy, is heavily dependent upon Russia for stocks of energy. And when there's a hit to that supply, or in this case, we're actually openly worried about Germany losing all access to Russian energy, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see recession and people losing jobs and businesses having a very difficult time. So that puts the European Central Bank in a tough spot. They haven't wanted to lift interest rates because lifting interest rates tends to discourage. The whole point of it is to discourage people from spending and borrowing and investing because you're worried about inflation in that scenario. The net of that is money goes out of the euro and goes into the dollar, and that gets expressed with the dollar increasing in value and the euro dropping in value.
Well, it's kind of fortuitous for us going to Mondragon in September. It'll be the first time that has been the case since we started going to Mondragon, that it's 1-to-1. Usually it's something like 10, 20, or even 30% difference. So another thing I wanted to ask you from your book, you mentioned key billionaires who are determining a lot of what goes on, not just in our country, but globally. And you mentioned Bezos, Benioff, Diamond, Schwartzman, Fink, Zuckerberg, several of these. And one of the things that you draw attention to is the philanthropy that these men are noted for, especially Benioff, who you spent a lot of time on in the book. And people have a very good opinion of Benioff because of the philanthropy and all the causes he gives to. However, you make a very good point, and I'd like you to say a little more about it, that if they just paid their taxes, that would be actually better for the society than their philanthropy.
Yeah, Benioff is an especially interesting character. The book's called Davos Man because I'm stealing basically a phrase coined by Samuel Huntington, the political scientist, back in 2004. The World Economic Forum in Davos, this annual gathering of the world's wealthiest, most powerful people. I'm using it a little more narrowly to talk about the slice of the billionaire class that wants us to believe that they are the solution to all of life's problems, that they are the good guys, as a kind of prophylactic against us using our democratic powers to impose progressive taxation, to regulate, to help labor with rules that encourages collective bargaining so working people can get their share of the gains of global capitalism. And Benioff is an especially intriguing character in this context because he's actually on the board of trustees of the World Economic Forum, and he's especially good in a kind of Silicon Valley cliche way of spinning this narrative where it's all about social purpose and everything else takes a backseat to that. He tells the story in his memoir, and he'll tell you personally, if you ask him, about how he started his company. He was working for Oracle, and he had kind of a crisis of confidence, and he didn't understand the meaning of life. And Larry Ellison, his boss, encouraged him to go off to India and take a sabbatical. And he tells this story of how he's in southern India meeting with a woman he refers to as the hugging saint. And in an incense-filled room, she embraces him and whispers in his ear that the purpose of his life is to make a lot of money and give it back to society. And he talks about how this is how he came up with the idea to launch Salesforce, this giant software company. Now, to his credit, he really does contribute 1% of the company's revenues to philanthropic efforts and 1% of staff time. And he has very generous benefits for his workforce, and he encourages people to go and work in homeless shelters. People have gone as far as the Tibetan Plain. People went to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. That part's all real. And when I first started spending time with Benioff, I'd hear about all he was doing in the midst of the pandemic, and in Davos itself, was actually virtual Davos in January of 2021. Benioff actually said CEOs are the heroes of the pandemic. I mean, that's an incredible statement we can parse. Not frontline medical workers, not parents dealing with the insanity of children cooped up, contending with distance learning. CEOs are the heroes of the pandemic. And then you press them on that. And you say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, businesses gave you vaccines, and financial institutions kept credit taps flowing. And I found 50 million pieces of PPE, personal protective gear, face masks, medical gowns. He outfitted frontline medical workers in San Francisco, where he's born and raised and headquartered. And that's true. He pulled strings with his associates in China and found 50 million pieces of PPE at a time when it was very hard to find them in the first wave of the pandemic. And he flew them to the States and into the UK and distributed them. And I'm willing to accept that probably saved some people's lives. But I also can't resist the question, why are we dependent upon the largesse of a tech bro to outfit our frontline medical workers in the midst of the worst pandemic in a century in what's supposed to be the most powerful country on earth? And part of the answer is that people like Mark Benioff have succeeded in not paying any taxes. Salesforce has not once but twice in the last 10 years paid the modest sum of $0 in federal taxes. And, Benioff will tell you about how you guys probably know this history better than I do, how he personally wrote a check for several $1 million to finance this ballot initiative in San Francisco that led to taxes on big tech companies to finance services for homeless people. Again, that's better than not having any of that. But what happens to homelessness when you organize your company around stock-based compensation that goes up because you're part of the business roundtable, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, other big lobby shops in Washington that were leading the charge for Trump's tax cuts, $1.5 trillion lavished on people like Mark Benioff? What happens when you lower the corporate tax rate And, it's not just Trump. You go back to Clinton and the opening up of the ability to move all your revenue offshore, book it in Ireland, and then bill your own company in the States for the use of the intellectual property, which now sits in Ireland. And, voila, on paper, you've made no money in the United States and you pay no taxes in the United States. Well, what happens is society breaks down. And not only do lots of people notice that it's incredibly unfair, but in situations like a pandemic, suddenly governments don't have any resources. They've been bled to the bone. What happens to infrastructure? How do we pay for the coders who go to work at places like Salesforce to help people like Mark Benioff make their billions? Nobody makes $1 billion without drawing quite aggressively on the largesse of society, and that's all of us. So yeah, I do spend a lot of time with Benioff, and I think Benioff is the key to understanding how this tribe, and I refer to them as a separate species, really, known as Davos Man, operates. They spend a lot of time just trumpeting their generosity, and this is really a way of preventing us from, again, using our democratic rights to have a say about how our capitalism works. It's a bid to prevent us from taxing them and regulating their companies.
Yes, and one of the things you noted in the book is all of these Davos men are lobbying governments constantly to lower taxes, not have taxes, certainly thwart Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren's idea for a wealth tax. So one of the next areas I want to get to is something that surprised me that I didn't know about, and that is the private money that's buying medical practices.
Yeah.
And this is just astonishing to me, especially this group called Team Health.
Yeah.
The health mergers, the surprise billing people are getting, the catastrophes that are exploited, where the purpose is profit, not health, and not healthcare, certainly. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about Team Health, the danger this poses to our healthcare system. And of course, they would be opposed to universal healthcare. But I'd like you to talk about that and give us some information about what they're actually doing.
Sure. Yeah, it's an incredibly important question. So Team Health is one of two private equity owned staffing companies that collectively employ 1 out of every 3 emergency room staff in the United States. I mean, these are, the other one is called, actually, it's been a while since I thought about them. They're MCare. And most of us have never heard of these companies, and we're not supposed to have heard of them. Steve Schwartzman, who's the founder of Blackstone, which is the company that bought Team Health for more than $6 billion about 6 years ago, he's a master of going wherever money is changing hands and getting a piece of it. He bought up foreclosed homes en masse after the great financial crisis and the Great Recession. And he understood that in a giant economy like the United States, where we spend more money on healthcare than anybody else for outcomes that are not better than other wealthy democratic societies, that's a good place to be. And like any good investor, he understands that it's especially good to be in the emergency room, because in the same way that a casino magnate understands that you can make a lot of money giving people a sense of hope in a dark room where they don't know what time it is, and they're drinking while they're engaging in your profit-making services. The emergency room's the place where the customer often shows up, not particularly inclined to start asking questions about the fine points of their health insurance coverage, whether you're in network, out of network, whatever. They sign on the dotted line so they can go see the people in the white coats in the back of the room and get help. And sure enough, Team Health has been part of a racket known as surprise billing. The surprise is not of the happy variety. You are in an emergency room and you think that you are in your network, and somebody shows up and they hand you a clipboard and you sign it. And what you've signed is the authorization to treat you with out-of-network providers. And then you go get your treatment. And a few weeks or months later, you start getting incredible bills for 4 or 5 times the normal level of service, often a dozen times what Medicare pays. I mean, that's our successful single payer healthcare system. And, people are harassed by bill collectors if they don't have the means to pay. People have ended up in bankruptcy as a result of this. And Blackstone's company, Team Health, has lobbied aggressively to keep this con going, usually by pretending to fix this problem and actually blaming greedy insurance companies. Davos Man's very good at saying, yeah, we understand there's a problem here. And by the way, we're the solution. The real problem is somebody else you don't like. And of course, good luck finding somebody in the United States who thinks the medical insurance racket is fantastic and looking out for our best interest. So that's how they've managed to keep this going. And I first stumbled on this story when I met a guy named Ming Lin, who's an ER doc at a hospital in Bellingham, Washington, or he was then. Ming Lin was a veteran of the emergency room. He had worked at a hospital close to the World Trade Center in New York during the attacks of September 11th. 2001. And he had a lot of experience, very dedicated guy. And somewhere around March of 2020, he starts asking some questions of his supervisors at the Bellingham Hospital. Why is it nobody's wearing a mask at the entryway? Why is it that we've got people sitting in waiting rooms who are coughing, who clearly have fevers, other apparent COVID symptoms? The governor of the state of Washington at this point has already declared an emergency. Why is it just business as usual in here? And he's told, well, we don't want people wearing masks because that will freak out the patients who are coming in. We have to have business as usual. We can't shut down, for instance, he suggests elective surgeries because that's the bread and butter of the hospital. And by the way, the hospital's our customer. We work for the hospital. And he eventually gets so concerned that he goes on Facebook and starts sharing his experiences. This is a guy, by the way, who was really not politically active. If you look at his Facebook feed, at that point, it was like pictures of himself with his kids in a swimming pool, his wife playing the violin, pictures of flowers. I mean, suddenly he's posting about these horrifying conversations he's having with his supervisors at this hospital in Bellingham, Washington. Eventually, he's told to knock it off. He refuses, and eventually he's fired, which is a clear marker that for companies like Blackstone, increasingly at the center of American healthcare, the profits are the thing that matters above all. I mean, we're talking about a whistleblower in a pandemic trying to prevent the spread of COVID-19 in American society. And it underscores that when private equity enters an area of life like healthcare, it turns into something much like, flying on a jet or going into Starbucks. Your airline wants every seat full so they can charge more for the seats. Your private equity owned healthcare facility wants every room full. This is why in the 2 decades before the pandemic in the US, we lost something like a third of our hospital rooms because, consultants at places like McKinsey said to private equity and other investors into healthcare, this is the key to success is pricing power. We need to limit capacity. We need to lower costs. And suddenly the patient is now a revenue source and medical staff are costs to be minimized. And, guess what? The people who are most important are the shareholders and the special shareholders, the people I call Davos Man, the billionaires who are really running the show.
Yeah, this is one thing I noted in reading your book, where Steven Schwartzman has Blackstone as his company, Larry Fink has BlackRock, Eric Prince has Blackwater, and it makes me think they're all into the black arts and they've sold their souls to the devil. It's interesting that they all pick these kinds of names. One of the things I wanted to go to next, I mean, there are lots of things. I'm interested in Italy and Sweden, and what's happening in Sweden is, I think, quite sad, and that some of their services are being privatized. But I don't want to get into that right now because we have we have to go to audience questions soon. And I wanted to go into the good examples that you gave. And one of them is Kaiser Permanente, which I'm a member of, and what they did in South Central Los Angeles, which I think is exemplary. And I'd like you to talk about that.
Sure.
And then the other was Preston, England, which also ignored Davos Man and the austerity that they were trying to promote for their community. So if you could just say a little bit about each of those, that would be.
Yeah, and they're related, actually. I mean, in terms of my own reporting, I first stumbled on, I was based in London. I was writing a bunch of stories about austerity, which was horrific. 10 years of governments basically cutting social services for ordinary people while lowering taxes for wealthy people to pay for the bailouts after the 2008 financial crisis, leading to an enormous amount of unhappiness. And I started to look for what's the solution to this? I wrote one big story about just the calamity that was befalling people who were in need of disability payments, unemployment, the bureaucracy. I mean, the UK was looking more and more like the US. And then somebody said, well, you should go on up to Preston, England, which is this town in the northwest of England, where they've forged this really interesting model. They got so disgusted with all these cuts imposed from London, and they had this catastrophic development plan that involved bringing in international investors to build a big shopping mall to replace their old market. And they pulled out after the 2008 financial crisis, and it just left an enormous amount of disappointment. And they thought, well, what can we do ourselves without depending upon outsiders? And they came up with this kind of ingenious plan where they got all the government entities. This encompassed a couple of different municipalities, not just Preston, which is a city of a couple 100,000 people, but also broader county governments, police forces, a couple of universities with their endowments. And they said, well, listen, what if through our procurement, when we contract for bed linen cleaning at a hospital, or when we hire at a university somebody to come in and do the meal service, or we're building a new police station, what if we have a real bias toward hiring local companies? So instead of sending our wealth out to shareholders somewhere, we're actually employing people in the community who are going to likely spend their money in the community, and we'll recycle the funds that way. And that was the Preston model. And it really worked spectacularly. There was a think tank that then did some analysis when I did a story in the Times, and I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it was pretty dramatic. It was like the amount of procurement that was devoted to local companies shifted within the first couple of years from something like 8% to close to 40%, if memory serves. You have to read the book to look it up. And then I started, when I went up there, I spent time with this local member of the city council. And I said, well, how'd you get onto this? And he said, well, I actually spent some time with a guy in the States named Ted Howard, who runs an outfit called the Democracy Collaborative. And you should really spend some time with him. So I looked him up, and he told me about some cooperatives that he had forged in Cleveland. And then he told me about this thing called the Healthcare Anchor Network, where, similar model to Preston, he had gotten some of the largest nonprofit healthcare systems in the US, including Kaiser. Kaiser was their biggest and their most important, to basically agree to do the same thing. We're going to build a new campus. We're going to look for local labor. We're going to hire any kind of service. We're going to look for local businesses. And I then focused on this new medical campus they developed in South Central LA, went and visited, and they actually had a really hard time figuring out how to hire local people until they found this wonderful guy named John Harrell, who's a former gang member who'd been incarcerated, who sort of made it his life's work to help other formerly incarcerated, mostly men, but some women too, figure out how to recover from this catastrophe and build productive careers that pay high enough wages that they can live middle-class lives. And so Kaiser essentially brought John Harrell in to go figure out a recruitment effort. And John Harrell found some appropriate people to get involved. And when they spent several $1 million on this new medical campus, there were a bunch of former gang members who had trained, who had become professional electricians, fully licensed, who were making, decent money. We're paying mortgages, had cars, we're taking care of children and grandchildren. And it was really quite an inspiring story. And lest you think that this is just some sort of little niche, the Healthcare Anchor Network, if memory serves, at the time I wrote about it, was comprised of more than half a dozen healthcare systems that collectively spend somewhere around $78 billion a year. So this is serious money. I mean, if we can influence the course of this money, all of us, we're living in a society where we're just so accustomed to hearing like, well, if Mitch McConnell's not for it, it's just not possible. And let's face it, Mitch McConnell's mostly for things that help the donor class. And that's the Davos Man who are able to hire lobbyists by the dozen in Washington. And communities like the ones John Harrell's thinking about, they don't really matter all that much. They don't contribute much in the way of money. They're hard to mobilize in terms of voting. So this was like a whole end run in the same way in which the Preston model was a way around London and austerity. Like, let's look at what we're actually in control of right here. I saw the Healthcare Anchor Network as the American version of that. I came away from that experience quite hopeful.
Great. I think what I'd like to do now is open this up for questions from our audience. So usually it takes like a minute before they do that. And while they're getting their question together, maybe I'll ask you to talk about Sweden. I was very concerned reading about the privatization of so many of the services in Sweden and what that is doing to their economy and to their social life there.
Yeah, I mean, Sweden is shocking to me because I think most of us, I imagine, have a similar feeling about Sweden, which is it is certainly a highly successful social democracy. And there's a lot to emulate if you're thinking about inequality. I mean, the generosity of the Swedish welfare state. I mean, a parent has a child in Sweden and there's 500 days of parental leave to be apportioned between the mom and the dad, however you like, anytime in the next 5 years. There's universal health care, there's universal education. I mean, there are so many ways in which Sweden has managed to address a lot of the problems that are just legion in our own society. And at the center of it is very high rates of tax, progressively, in exchange for very generous social services. But beginning in the 90s, when there was a big economic crisis in Sweden, Davos Man started to get the upper hand. I tell the story of Ingemar Kamprad, who's the founder of IKEA, who famously leaves to get away from high wealth taxes. And suddenly there's this movement to lower wealth taxes, and those wealth taxes are paid for through a serious diminution of the social safety net. And a bunch of things happen as a result of this. One of them is a story that I tell in every economy I write about. Trump in the US, Brexit in the UK, the rise of the extreme right in Italy, the rise of the yellow vests in France, which is the billionaires managed to further this bottom-up distribution of wealth. Time passes, unhappiness results. It's kind of incoherent. No one has a really clear, coherent explanation of what's happened, but there's a broad realization amongst lots of ordinary people that, oh, my needs, my ability to support my family at a middle-class wage, that doesn't seem to matter very much to the powers that be. And that, is a tremendous opportunity for political opportunists who typically come along and they blame somebody else, foreigners, immigrants, Muslims, some vulnerable community, and they say they're the problem. It's Mexican gangs. We need to build a wall. That's why you're not living in a middle class standard anymore. China ate our lunch. We need to have a trade war, as opposed to looking domestically. So that's a story that I tell throughout the book in all of these contexts. Well, in Sweden, the Sweden Democrats a party with its roots in the neo-Nazi movement rises from a total fringe, kind of lunatic fringe party to the third most popular party in the country. And they start peddling this kind of blatant racism dressed up as kind of fiscal sensibility. And they say essentially, yeah, we're all for high taxes and generous social services, but everybody's got to work. And these new people, 2015, huge influx of migrants. We're talking about refugees from Somalia, from Yemen, from Libya, from Afghanistan. These people, they don't speak Swedish. They're low skilled. They're not going to work. We're going to be paying for them. It's sort of like the welfare queen argument that's familiar to us in the States. Never mind that the Swedish welfare system is incredibly successful at training people. And while it's true that a lot of these newcomers, it is going to cost a lot of money to house them, to pay for their health care, to get them fit for some kind of job. Their children are going to grow up Swedish. They're going to speak native Swedish. They're going to be ready to participate in society and pay taxes. But the Sweden Democrats rise by arguing that Sweden can no longer afford this generosity, and then these cuts. The cost of the cuts to things like healthcare and other social services really become painfully obvious in the first wave of the pandemic, when Sweden has something like 5,000 deaths, rates of death, 10 and 12 times its neighbors, hitting senior citizens' homes, especially privatized ones, especially hard. And I did some reporting there where I learned, much to my horror, that the protocol in senior citizens' homes in March of 2020 was, if you've got COVID symptoms and you live in one of these homes, you go on a morphine drip without so much as a doctor examining you. It is lights out. It is goodbye. And I spoke to doctors within the broader national healthcare system who said, look, we understood that we just simply didn't have the capacity to handle the big demand for ventilators, for hospital rooms, because they too had cut their hospital rooms quite a bit in response to these budget cuts. And so the result was a de facto policy of euthanasia. I mean, that's a particularly profound example of what happens when you cut services for everyone in order to finance tax cuts for a handful of well-connected people.
Well, that's really shocking. Before I call on Nicole, she will be the first question. I just want to recommend to everybody that you get a copy of Davos Man. It's an extraordinary book. And as you can hear from the talk today, there is a lot of information in there that you want. So Nicole, go ahead.
Yes, Mr. Goodman, why do you think smart liberals like Chris Hedges are not talking much about the rather creepy Great Reset plans of the Davos, Bilderberg, bankster types? You think that this would be a major concern on progressive journalist minds? Thank you.
Yeah, I have to say that I think a lot of I don't really buy the notion that Davos is like this secret government with a master plan for how we all live. I actually think it's pure artifice. If you go, I've been to the World Economic Forum 10 times. There's a lot of Great Reset talk. And then there's a lot of whatever it is that you care about. I can guarantee you there's some smart, thoughtful person talking about it at the World Economic Forum. The billionaires aren't going there to listen to it. The billionaires are in their suites making deals and schmoozing one another, and actually taking pride. And the cool kids will actually tell you, oh, I never even set foot inside the Congress Center. I'm too busy, meeting other billionaires to do deals. Although, quick aside, a little Davos color, they do go in to engage in, simulations of the Syrian refugee experience. I am not making this up. They will submit to being blindfolded and led around in the dark while someone's hollering at them in Arabic, demanding papers. And then they congratulate one another for their empathy. And then they go off to some, offsite banquet underwritten by some giant tech company. And they, drink champagne and eat truffles and caviar. That's reality. But the agenda itself I think most of us would not find particularly objectionable. I mean, there's a lot of talk about climate change. There's a lot of talk about racial injustice, gender imbalance, how to make corporate governance more transparent. The Forum has done all sorts of research on the need to have progressive taxation to deal with the economic inequality, the argument for greater antitrust enforcement. It's not like there's some sort of agreed upon secret plan. Rather, the point of Davos, as I argue in the book, is it's a way for billionaires to kind of virtue signal on the cheap. So the genius of the Forum, when it was convened by this guy Klaus Schwab, who I write about in the book, is it, unlike Fortune or Forbes, they have their conferences where business people get together and basically just talk about ways to make more money. The Forum convenes under this kind of ridiculous mantra, committed to improving the state of the world, which is, a fantastic phrase for an entity that's dominated by the people who are the ultimate beneficiaries of the status quo and are very much vested in perpetuating the status quo. But the point of the Forum is to say, look, here we are talking about climate change. We got this. So you don't have to stick us with carbon taxes. We'll take care of this. And here we are talking about inequality and demonstrating our real commitment to tackling inequality. Never mind that if you go listen to the solutions on offer, they never, amongst the people who actually have to sacrifice, they never talk about higher taxation or more regulation or more labor rights. They talk about, win-win solutions, because when everybody wins, no one has to sacrifice. But I think the Forum, it's not that the Forum has so much power. It's that the Forum doesn't really have any power. It's just a gathering of the people who already have the power, who don't need things like the Forum, because they largely control Congress and they have influence at the European Central Bank and the City of London. They don't need another place to dominate.
Okay, I'm going to go to Ben next.
Yes, I wanted to ask our guests. I've heard Davos Man described as a kind of a rebranding effort by neoliberal capitalism to present themselves as we're the embodiment of the forward momentum of progress. We're the cutting edge of the, cultural, intellectual, move of the civilized world. And it's essentially a way of creating an image of the future that has some draw, where in general, politics has fallen into a level of depression and culture is tending toward a kind of a nihilism. So people like Musk, for example, is the archetype of his brand is I represent the future. And, it doesn't bear up under scrutiny. I'm with you. I would far rather get the amount of taxes from these people rather than them setting up their little private charities to try to address a piece of the problem. But I just think that's what is going on here, that it's an attempt to rebrand this enterprise, particularly after the 2008 crash. It's taken a hit. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that, the latest attempt to rebrand is this thing called stakeholder capitalism that I get into in some detail in the book, where, the Business Roundtable, which is an important lobbying group in Washington that's made up of the CEOs of major publicly traded companies, they declare in the summer of 2019, okay, we've got this new statement of a purpose of a corporation. Milton Friedmanism is part of history. We're not just going to organize around returning profit to shareholders. Now we're catering to stakeholders, and stakeholders include, labor, not labor unions. They're not interested in labor unions. This is all unilateral generosity, but labor, local communities, the environment. In fact, Benioff actually said during a TV interview a couple of years ago, the planet is a stakeholder, which is very comforting to those of us who live on the planet. And something like 181 CEOs signed this statement, and a lot of kind of credulous access journalists wrote this up as this great leap. Business is now ruled by a sense of social concern. And then we had the pandemic, which was the first real test of this new statement of a purpose of a corporation. And what we saw, there's been some academic research on this, is that companies that didn't even sign the pledge did more for their workers and for society in general than the companies who did sign the pledge. Guess who signed the pledge? Jeff Bezos signed the pledge. Now, Jeff Bezos managed to add to his fortune such that at one point he was worth $200 billion, while he supposedly can't find protective gear like gloves and gowns and sanitizer for his warehouse workers, who he then lauds for their sacrifice, keeping other people's grandmothers alive, and says Amazon's prioritizing the product mix, in order to make sure all this stuff's getting out the door. I had a great interview with Christian Smalls, the guy who you guys probably know because he organized the first Amazon union in Staten Island, who said, look, we could see what's going in the boxes. We understand we're putting hand sanitizer and gloves and all the stuff they can't give us to the people who are paying for it. They've got it. It's just not for us. It's for the people paying the bills. Okay, so he's one person who signed it. Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, signs the pledge. Pfizer takes these vaccines. Thanks for the vaccines. They made a huge amount of difference for those of us who are lucky enough to have them, but sells them to the highest bidder around the world. And the bulk of humanity can't get them. And until recently, you got frontline medical workers in places like Pakistan who are treating COVID patients while we're getting our second booster shot in the US. And while, we're sitting on stocks that we're never even going to use, like our AstraZeneca stocks. So, clearly, yes, there is a rebranding afoot, and that rebranding is very much about saying, hey, we understand that economic inequality has fostered a lot of unhappiness. We know people think we're not the good guys, but look, we are the good guys. So hold off on anything radical like imposing taxes on us or regulating or enforcing antitrust laws, something that, we haven't experienced since the 1980s in this country.
Right, thank you. Katie? Katie, where are you? She had her hand up. No, I don't see her. Someone else want to ask something before we?
Yes, can you hear me? Sorry,
Yeah.
Took me a minute.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Peter. I want to say your demeanor adds to the content, which is so brilliant. It's nice to see. It's just a pleasure to see kind of a bit of personality and emphasis in your language. Some people are pretty dry on the subject of money. So I want to preface my question briefly with the fact that I work in mental health, and I worked front lines with the ICU nurses during the pandemic the first year. Wow. And we don't need to be told, but it was beyond the horrors that you've heard. Nurses being sued by doctors, nurses going home to their husbands who would refuse to be vaccinated with 3 kids, people infighting because they were so regressed and stressed and traumatized, not to mention most of the systems that I'm working with now are falling apart. And in addition to that, in mental health, there is none, basically. And those people that do call me get 5 sessions through Blue Cross or something, which is ridiculous. And then the handcuffs with them are just strenuous for my end. Here's my question. There's a lot of, we can discuss, and we have done a great job, you have done also, on the problems. What can we do, those of us here today, when we get off this, this discussion, what can we do? Because I'm, the feeling of victimization and helplessness is just getting to be a bit much.
Well, that's an incredibly important question. And the short answer is what we need to do is quite simple to describe and very difficult to execute. We need to have a serious reapportionment of wealth. And we need to understand that taking care of people who are in a vulnerable state, which is all of us at some point in our lives, is, you know, something that even if you're looking at it just through the narrow lens of, you know, return on assets or, you know, minimizing taxpayers' exposure or efficiency or like whatever kind of horrible McKinsey-like, you know, lens you've got, there's a benefit. You know, there's a benefit to taking care of vulnerable people. And I come back to an experience I had. You know, I've spoken negatively of Sweden, but here's the positive, you know, part of Sweden. I remember going to visit a mining company in 2017 where there were a bunch of workers who were threatened with job losses because of automation. And I expected all these guys would be against, you know, self-driving cars and other forms of automation. And they all said, oh, no, we're for it. If it makes the company more competitive, you know, that's great. And if we don't have jobs, well, they'll train us for some other jobs. And people have jobs, we'll get higher wages. And this was not out of some sort of like religious faith. This was based on their lived experience, because Sweden has a system where unions have very strong authority. They represent, you know, 70+% of workers in most industries, and the unions meet with employers' council representatives, and they hash out wage structures that basically have to give the productivity gains of the economy to the workforce, which is exactly the opposite of what we got in the States. Now, this is my long-winded way of saying Sweden is actually more innovative as a result of this by having more generous social services, because these people understood, oh, if I lose my job, first of all, I've got health care. I'm not worried about pulling my kid out of college. I'm not going to lose my house because there's help available. And there will be very effective job training that will set me up for some new career. People can actually take risks that we can't take in the States. They have a more vibrant economy as a result of that. But, you know, what do we actually have to do? We have to get back to progressive taxation. We have to enforce antitrust, so we're not just dealing with monopoly companies that have the ability to increase their profit margins, you know, every time there's some kind of shock like the pandemic, and leave less and less for everyone else. And we need to give labor the power to bargain. Now, that's easier said than done, because Davos Man is not going to unilaterally disarm. So we've got to look for opportunities that we're in control of ourselves in terms of how our localities, our states, you know, spend their money, like the wealth building stuff that we've talked about in the context of the Mondragon cooperatives, or this Preston model in England, or the healthcare anchor network. You know, these are some good examples. But we got to understand that, like, we've been here before. Like we've been here before in the context of the robber barons, who, you know, in the 1920s had tremendous power. They controlled the levers of democracy, and it took a concerted mobilization to bring us things that we then had that were very successful, like progressive taxation and antitrust enforcement, so that in the first 3 decades after World War II, a rising tide, the old cliche, really did lift all boats, and we had economic growth. We had much higher taxes, and everybody gained. Now, I don't have a fetish for going back to 1964. We don't want to go back to Jim Crow. We made a lot of social progress we want to hang on to, but we got to get back to that. We got to get back to a setup where people can count on, if they set their alarm clock and they go off to work and they stay out of trouble, they can earn a decent enough living that they can take care of their families, and that's vital. But that will entail taking on the power of Davos Man, which requires continued mobilization.
Indeed, it does. One of the things you mentioned about the risk taking that they're able to take in Sweden is very interesting as it applies to Mondragon, because they also, with their worker-owned businesses, they have the largest research and development complex in all of Europe. And they've been able to do that because they have their own banks, their own businesses, and they're able to support a lot of research and development into cutting edge work, really. And this has been allowed by the structure that they've built. So worker ownership is certainly part of this plan,
For sure.
I think, that would make a big difference in the world if we had more of it. So I wanted to go, we have maybe one last question, and if there isn't anyone other than Nicole, I'll go back to her, but usually I look for new people who haven't asked anything yet. So if there's anyone else who wants to ask before we end, this would be the time to do it. Okay, I don't see any hands going up, so I will go back.
Oh, I see a hand.
Yeah, that's Nicole.
Oh.
No, Jeffrey.
So I'll go back to you,
yes,
Nicole.
this is okay. Thank you. You will own nothing and be happy sounds pretty creepy to me. People are already noticing how hard it is to actually get to test drive just a computer now. That they want to test drive in person. It's like the big box electronic stores, for example, they're just not stocked. And that's not, I'm just not talking about electronic stores, but it seems like these stores are like minimally stocked now. And these are items that people need to check out in person before buying. Everyone seems to be corralled to buy online now. This is force herding customers. It's also harder now to buy actual hard copies of important apps like Adobe Photoshop that customers prefer to own and not rent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
On that, Peter.
Well, you know, it's interesting. My next book that I'm working on now is on the supply chain, called How the World Ran Out of Everything. And I'm essentially going to argue that we took a very smart idea that Toyota pioneered, known as just-in-time manufacturing, where instead of the old Henry Ford mass production model, where you just make as much stuff as you possibly can, and then you jam it down the distribution system through dealers, you only make what you need, and you have stuff show up on the assembly line when it's needed. Well, that mindset got hijacked by the consultant class. In my next book, I'll really indict McKinsey, and turned into this crude imperative to just slash inventory. And that seeped into thinking about government, about healthcare, and it was really about the triumph of the shareholder over the worker. So instead of taking the bounty from economic growth and distributing it to the people who are doing the work, we just give it to the handful of people who are running companies or lucky enough to own shares. And that kind of thinking has saturated most major economies, and was really a critical factor in why the pandemic has been so wrenching, because resilience just doesn't matter much. No CEO of a publicly traded company ever got promoted or got a bigger payday for spending more money worrying about doing right by workers, or filling a warehouse with a ventilator that we might need one day, but not today, but something bad could happen. Whereas lots of CEOs have cashed in handsomely by treating labor like just a disposable cost that has to be minimized, and gutting inventory so they can make their return on assets look better on paper. And those incentives are still very much with us. And that's really at the heart of our problem.
Okay. Yes,
I don't mean to interrupt, sorry, but Jeffrey did have his hand up, but only in the video form.
Okay, Jeffrey, do you want to ask your question? Jeffrey?
I think you're muted, Jeffrey.
He's unmuting. He's
unmute. Yeah. I'm just Peter. I'm just reading a book about the Russian millionaires, and I just wondered, Russian billionaires rather. I was just wondering if you had any take on what they have called the KGB, billionaires in Russia, and how that relates to your perspective.
Well, I'm no expert on the group we call the oligarchs, but I don't hear a lot of talk from the oligarchs that we're supposed to view them as the solution to all of life's problems, and I think ironically, in terms of our sanctions policy on Putin, putting aside the question of whether it's rational to expect that if we make life difficult for Putin's billionaire cronies, that will translate into pressure on Putin to relent on Ukraine, that's debatable by itself. it turns out we're not even generating that much pressure on a lot of Putin's oligarchs because of our unwillingness to take on our own oligarchs. You know, a lot of the sanctions have done a very serious job on making the U.S. banking system and the British banking system off limits to Russian money. And if, you know, someone were silly enough to try to dump a huge amount of money in J.P. Morgan Chase coffers, the feds would be on them and there'd be immediate enforcement. But we've had a major set of loopholes that applies to industries like private equity. So, you know, Steve Schwartzman doesn't want to have there be transparency about who's investing in Blackstone's funds. And as a result of that, we don't know where the money's coming from. And one can imagine money's coming from Russia. I mean, we certainly know it has in the past. They've courted Russian money, and they don't face any kind of disclosure requirements for continuing to accept it. So as a result of our unwillingness to go after our own billionaire class, we've essentially kneecapped our own effort to hurt the Russian billionaire class.
No, this is kind of shocking. Peter, this has been great today. I mean, it's just been such a full hour with lots of ideas, and I think a lot of things people might want to discuss when we have our discussion next Friday. But I so appreciate the time you've taken with us, your brilliance, your knowledge. It's just been wonderful. So any last words you want to say?
Oh, I just want to say I'm really grateful to you guys for having me. I've told Georgia that I've spent a lot of very happy times at my cousin's cabin on the Sonoma coast, somewhere around Occidental. So I long ago was a cub reporter at the Sacramento Bee, and went to Berkeley for grad school. So Northern California has got a special place in my heart. And I really appreciate you guys taking the time, and thanks for all your excellent questions. Thanks for convening this, George. I'm grateful.
Well, thank you. And I do want to talk to you again about Mondragon. So I will get
Love it.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. And be sure to get the book.
Take care, everyone. Yeah. Have a great summer. Okay. Cheers. Bye.